Shalom and welcome to the Jewish Broadcasting Service. My name is Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove, the rabbi of Park Avenue Synagogue.
I'm Rabbi Angela Buchdahl from Central Synagogue.
And I'm Rabbi Chaim Steinmetz of Congregation Kehilath Jeshurun.
I want to express my gratitude to Jewish Broadcasting Service for bringing colleagues and friends together. Hine matovu manayim shevet achim ve'achot gam yachad. How good and how pleasant it is when brothers and sisters sit around a table, rabbis even, to be together. And I feel that sense of the need to be together at this time with the backdrop of what's taking place in Israel, what's taking place in Gaza. The world has been turned on its head, and we are a people in pain, and we are a people facing great anxiety, and we are a people who are in need of the company of each other. And I can tell you that there's no two people that I find as much comfort as being in your presence, Rabbi Buchdahl, in your presence, Rabbi Steinmetz. We come together in good times. Unfortunately, this is a tough time for all of us to be together. So thank you again to Jewish Broadcasting Service for making this happen. Rabbis, you know, the last time we were all together, it was right before the high holidays, and we were debating. We were actually having a fun conversation. Are we going to talk about Israel? Are we not going to talk about Israel? We all trade notes, both at JBS and not on JBS, and I think all of us ended up in one of our high holiday sermons talking about Israel. And I'm just curious now if you could play that time machine decision to talk about Israel, maybe what you said and how the world has changed, and how maybe that sermon has aged well or not well, what we knew might happen, what we didn't know would happen. How do you reflect on that moment last time we were together to this moment today?
Well, I'll pick up because our conversation at JBS was actually quite consequential. When we spoke, you both were speaking about Israel, and I was actually still talking about AI and something else. And it was actually in part this conversation, in addition to a couple of really important sort of Israeli podcasts that I was listening to, that within a week made me change my mind. And I thought, how am I not talking about Israel right now? This is the greatest sort of, I thought, existential crisis for Israel. Now, little did I know that it was going to be even more real. So I ended up speaking about Israel, and I think it was a very important moment of, engagement for my community as I think that people knew about the judicial crisis and about the cultural divide that was happening in Israel. There really was a kind of an internal civil war. And one of the kind of orienting metaphors that I shared, or teachings for the sermon, was a story that comes from the Talmud about conjoined twins, two heads, one body. And the rabbinic debate is, do you have to wrap two sets of tefillin or just one? Because that's what ancient rabbis care about, apparently. And they use the answer that comes actually from King Solomon, who had to decide when he saw conjoined twins, do they get a double inheritance or a single one? So his method, and King Solomon really had a method, like cutting the baby in half. Okay, his method was, in order to find out if it's two people or one person, you pour boiling water on one head, and if the other head screams, then you know actually that it's really one soul. And I actually invited the congregation to actually imagine, I said this is not theoretical right now, the other head is screaming, and are we feeling anything? And for some of my congregants, that was, they felt compelled, and they did, when they had to actually consider, what if Israel didn't exist anymore, did they care? And I think some of them answered that in different ways, but I would have never imagined that, was it 6 weeks later, that it truly was actually in deep existential physical crisis, and the answer was yes, we do care. We are one people. We are one soul. We feel that pain over there, and that is not a prophecy that you want to see fulfilled in any way, but it was really powerful to understand our peoplehood in a very different way when we saw the suffering of our brothers and sisters in Israel. Probably also compounded by the fact that we also are experiencing our own crisis here in America, what's and anti-Semitism that has been kind of unleashed and revealed in a way. I'll share one other thought that was a piece of the talk that I think is relevant, and there's still much of it that I don't know now how well it has aged, but I brought up Micha Goodman's teaching about the fact that there is a curse of the 8th decade, that in the other 2 times that we have had sovereignty over ourselves, 3,000 years ago with King David's dynasty, and then the Hasmonean dynasty that went into the Second Temple period, that it was infighting, Jews against Jews in the 8th decade, that caused the beginning of the downfall. And so here we have our 3rd sovereign nation, and we are in the 8th decade of Israel, right? And so it begs the question of like, what happens in the 8th decade? And Micha explained that in the 1st and 2nd generations, they don't take their state for granted. They know what it's like not to have a state. And so they're willing to sacrifice and work for the whole. But what happens is after the 3rd, 4th generation, they take it for granted. Micha Goodman, when I visited Israel just a few weeks ago, he explained that for 12 long hours on October 7th, Israelis actually had a taste of what it felt like to not have a state. An army that didn't come quickly, a government that was not functioning, not to feel like they had sovereignty in their own land. And he said in some ways what it did was actually create a whole new first generation, a foundational generation that actually will never take for granted what it is to have sovereignty again. And so it's very interesting to imagine now we're in the 8th decade post-Holocaust, and as American Jews, I think we got very complacent about anti-Semitism and its role. And I think we are also waking up to something in the 8th decade as well for us about threats that are still here.
So I it's interesting. I did want to talk about Israel, but I didn't want to really put it on the fault lines of politics. And so I wanted to talk about Israel from sort of a different perspective. So I spoke about the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. And one of the great themes was the theme of how brokenness can help you rebuild and recreate your own identity. And I read a great deal about the Yom Kippur War, which actually came to haunt me when this attack occurred, because you see a lot of the same things. In other words, the Yom Kippur War, there was a moment where had the Syrians advanced into the Galilee, the state of Israel might have been gone. And you feel like you had that same moment here in this war. Had Hezbollah decided to go all in, had Iran and Syria decided to go all in, that it would have been uncertain.
Yeah.
And it would have been far more frightening than it already was. And I look back at that sermon, and it sort of sat in my mind, and it came back after the Simchat Torah attack, because it forced me to think about, oh my goodness, we thought this was ancient history. We thought this was in the past. And here it is now again. Now, of course, the purpose of having a sermon about Israel was to talk about the divisions in Israel. And I didn't want to talk about it frontally, but I did want to talk about that when you feel vulnerable, you recognize who really is with you. And I think that's been the reality of the last 5 weeks, that really the one thing, the one silver lining, is that everyone is together. There is a rabbi that I met with when I was in Israel who lost his own son at the very beginning of the war, Rav Tamir Granot. And perhaps we'll talk about him a bit more later, but Rav Tamir Granot mentions that at his shiva, because he's the sort of person who has relationships with many different sectors of Israeli society, he had a secular couple, he had a couple of Hasidic Jews, he had a couple of people from the right, a couple of people from the left, and then a rocket comes, and the sirens go off, and they all have to squeeze into one little safe room. And he said, this is a metaphor for what is happening right now. We are all together in one little safe room and learning how to live together. And I think that all of our sermons that would have been given on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur about the divisions in Israel would now have to be reversed. And we'd have to look at them in a totally different way. Because we're learning once again what Jewish unity can be.
Absolutely. What about you, Elliot?
Look, some aspects of my sermon I think are more important than ever. Some have not aged well. I spoke also, one of my sermons was on 50 years of the Yom Kippur War. And I obviously had no idea what was going to happen. None of us had any idea what was going to happen. And so I look back on it as both of you either did explicitly or implicitly, talking about the divisions of Israeli society, and little did we know that what we thought to be the greatest existential threat, it was actually much worse, and is actually much worse. And so there I look back on it as sort of a timepiece, like, oh, what were you thinking, Cosgrove, at the time? At the same time, the way that I approached the issue was the Jewish response to trauma. And, sort of at the double helix of the Jewish DNA is either to take our trauma, you can use a million examples, Purim, Hanukkah, Passover might be the most obvious one. Do you read Jewish history as in every generation a new Pharaoh arises to destroy us, and therefore we have to be vigilant, on guard, and fearful of the other? Or do you read it that you were once a stranger in a strange land, therefore you identify with the heart of a stranger? And so that same traumatic experience, does it prompt us towards empathy, or does it prompt us towards vigilance and fear of the other? The unfortunate fact is that I think what's been unleashed, aside from the horrors of October 7th, is that nerve within the Jewish psyche has been hit hard, and this sort of tribalism and circling the wagons, we've seen it come alive, right? We thought that the greatest threat was judicial reform, or I did, and now it's actually turned into a fear of the other. And I think both in wonderful ways, we're all in that safe room together. The divisions that used to separate us as Jews now have melted away. But there's also a fact that we are all thrust into this defensive posture of us against them. And I think that's a reality that we're facing right now. It's not a good one. I'd much rather be concerned with the condition of the stranger because of my historical experience. But right now, I'm circling the wagons. Right now, I'm concerned about the well-being of the Jewish people, of course, in Israel, and the Jewish people in the diaspora. The interesting speech that I gave, and just shortly after the high holidays, there was a pro-democracy rally in New York City, and that one has aged well. Because when I stood up there that day and I said, we are here because we support a safe Jewish democratic state, with very little modification, I could give that same speech right now, because those are the values that are constant, and those are the values that we're defending right now, a safe Jewish democratic state. So that's how I reflect on from then till now. But I didn't have the opportunity yet. My colleague Rabbi Zuckerman went to Israel on a solidarity mission, but the two of you actually went there recently. So I'm just wondering if maybe Chaim, will start with you, and then Angela, what did you see? What did you experience? All of us are here in North America wondering what's a lived experience on the ground. So what was that like to go to Israel?
Well, I mean, to quote Dickens, it was the best of times and it was the worst of times, because you could see the worst. We went to a military base, and you got the sense of that they were still scrambling when we were there to pull it all together, to be ready, because they were not ready. And that's actually quite frightening when you're in the middle of a war. It's understandable because they had the largest military call-up in their history, but at the same time, it's still very disconcerting. You see the worst of times because you see the tragedies. You see young people who were murdered. You hear story after story. You see the trauma on the faces of children. We went to visit a group from Kibbutz Nirim, and one mother was relating to us that her husband had hid their 2 daughters, ages 2 and 6, under a blanket. And it was quiet in the room. He had actually killed a terrorist who was trying to enter the room. They actually had to take the family out the window because they didn't want the girls to see the dead man on the floor. And he had killed the terrorists, and they sat there for hours, deathly quiet. So the mother was relating to us that her daughters can't stand to be anywhere quiet because they relate quiet to trauma. And you hear these stories, and it's just, you're overwhelmed. And then, of course, you hear the stories of some of the terrible acts of murder, and it's overwhelming. So that's the worst of times. The best of times, you see courage, you see kindness, you see solidarity. We visited in Eilat, we visited this place that was being run by a woman. It's one of these centers where they have, for everybody who is one of the mifunim, one of the evacuees, they have whatever you need. You come in, you take it for free. So we went to the woman, Liat, who was running the center, and we said, well, how did it get started? It was like a week and a half later, and they're running something that's the size of Fairway. And she said, well, the first day we heard that there were people who needed something, so we got together some supplies. We went to this corner, and people came and picked up supplies, and then the next day more supplies came, more volunteers came. They went from place to place to place until they had this huge room. When we were there were at least 150 people picking up goods. And what I learned is that kindness can be contagious. That one person who wants to do something good and another person watches them, that other person can catch that kindness and follow through on it. And then you see the courage. I mean, I met with a rabbi friend of mine, Rabbi Donon Parrot, who runs the World Mizrahi organization. And he had 2 sons who were in battle on the first day. One who got injured, and the other who was a tank commander who is presumed in the hands of Hamas. The one who was injured actually was meant to get married the following week. And the family had to make a decision. And it was a difficult decision. It was an agonizing decision. And they decided to go ahead with the wedding. And it's an enormous, it requires an enormous amount of courage to do that. It's not something that happens ordinarily. But I asked him, I said, well, how did you do it? He said, because we believe as Jews that you always have to pursue life. And that's exactly what he did. So there are so many horrible things that one can relate after a trip to Israel. But there were so many beautiful things that I could come back and talk about because you have incredible kindness, incredible solidarity, and incredible courage that is taking place right now.
I'm going to add actually that it so much all resonates, and to share that we also had the privilege of meeting Doron Parrot, Rabbi Parrot, and his son Yonatan was there. He was dressed in his army uniform about to go back to his base. And here he is, a newlywed. He's still actually recovering from his gunshot wound on his leg. And his father explained proudly, but with tears in his eyes, that Yonatan is actually exempt from going back to the army because, not just his injury, but because they have another son who's held captive. And so the IDF does not want to put that kind of a strain on a family. But that Yonatan came to him with the waiver saying, you need to sign this so that I can go back. And his father said, I don't want you to go. And Yonatan said to him, you're speaking like a father, but this is the son you raised me to be, and I need to go protect our country. And, I tear up thinking about it still, but that kind of selflessness and sense of purpose, we saw that all throughout. There are banners around Israel that say, Bayachad ninatzeach. Together, we will prevail. And you see it in all kinds of places. So we visited several hamals, which is an acronym for a cheder milchama, a situation room. And they have, like the one in Jerusalem, over 5,000 volunteers have been there in the last few weeks. They have everything from clothing, supplies, rides, and you see a world-renowned professor of Jewish history who's 70 years old, sitting next to a 29-year-old, doing the same job, helping make sure people get rides or supplies to the places they need. The person who was showing us around, he said today was supposed to be election day for municipal elections, and that woman over there is my rival. But for now, those elections are off, and they are in that room together for the same purpose. And so you are seeing a kind of unity and sacrifice and kindness and courage and bravery that is beyond. And I feel like I also had the sense that hakol patuach, everything is possible right now. When you have thousands of Haredim enlisting in the army right now, in the IDF, when just a month before, literally one of the points of contention was that most Haredim wanted to make sure that their exemption from army service was going to be codified. You actually literally now had thousands of people who have signed up to serve. Not to mention, of course, countless Haredi communities that are cooking meals for the IDF and volunteering side by side. That is astonishing. When you hear this story, I don't know if you've heard this story, but there was a famous lieutenant, Guy Martyr, who was saved at the last minute. He was wearing civilian clothes because he ran with his pistol into the fighting, killed several Hamas terrorists, but then got shot himself, ended up kind of crawling into a ditch, and from there he was able to shoot a few more Hamas terrorists, but he was basically there with his last energy. He tied a tourniquet on his leg and waited for someone to save him. While he was lying in the ditch, it took 2 hours. IDF soldiers came, but he was in civilian clothes. He was holding a gun, and they were about to shoot him. And someone said, "Wait! He has seat on." And in this dramatic moment, his seat saved his life. Okay. I don't know if you know this, there is now a run on seat for the army. They're literally making seat around the clock, and a rabbi just made a determination that he said they can be made 24/7 even on Shabbat because this is pikuach nefesh. And you're talking about secular Israelis who were allergic to anything that had like a whiff of religiousness, who are now wearing seat while they go to war. And it's almost like it has become this permission to reconnect to something that they had kind of thrown away. So I say this just as a story of some of the things that it almost feels like anything is possible right now. And this sense of kind of shared purpose and achdut is extraordinary.
Well, I'm hoping to go. I
know you will. You'll be bringing your people as you always do.
And it's an important act of solidarity, and it's an important message to send back to the community. And it'll happen soon. But our lives have been, my life has been turned upside down.
I think you can say our lives.
And our lives. And just to be a congregational rabbi during this time, I was in a staff meeting and we talk about it. We say there's our life as congregational leaders, as rabbis, before October 7th and after October 7th. And it's a funny thing, an awkward thing to say, but usually Simchas Torah is the moment where you give yourself that chance to breathe. You've made it through the Chagim, and here we are now looking at the sort of very busy stretch between the Chagim and Thanksgiving, or whatever interval you work
Mar
with.
Cheshvan is like this beautiful holiday with month with no holidays, and so we get to take a break, but not this time. And
I just, we've had a total pivot in our community and the Park Avenue family, whether that's in advocacy, whether that's in philanthropy, whether that is a congregational trip to Israel, the rallies. There were 10,000 people on Central Park West. Mm-hmm. There's a big DC rally. All of these moments of activism that are happening in synagogues themselves, and rabbis by extension have become communal leaders in a way that I guess I understood in theory, but now in practice, a community organizing in the classic sense of it, and trying to mobilize the membership, working in partnership with others. We're working in dialogue with civic leaders. We're working in dialogue with religious leaders of other faith communities as well. And I'm just wondering, I could go on and on about this in sort of a therapy mode. That's a problem with sitting with you guys, that it becomes therapy, but my life has totally changed, and not for the better. And so because none of us would have asked for this moment. So I'm just wondering, what is, and maybe we'll compare notes on this, how have your lives changed as congregational rabbis in the last, since October 7th?
I'm curious in particular for you, Chaim, because I imagine so many of your students, for example, are in Jewish day school, and you run a giant day school as well, and it's probably a very different experience for them than kids who are in secular schools. And I'm just wondering what their experience is. But you've got college students.
Are completely on. Well, college is really a whole other discussion, which we probably should get to. What it's like at universities, but to really talk about it, what it's like as a rabbi. You're right. I mean, there was no downtime after Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Personally, it's very stressful. I found it difficult to sleep the first week. It was just very traumatic. It was traumatic after coming back from Israel, frankly. So it's personally stressful. And of course, what you do all day and all night is you just think about Israel. I went to the first staff meeting. I said, whatever we have on deck, it's off. Now it's only Israel. That's all we're doing. I would say just the one really wonderful thing to watch is that my entire community has gotten engaged. Like, if I stepped out now, it would just be one person less, because everybody is engaged. We have an Israel Action Committee. We have every day people who are doing, every morning they sit and they read Tehillim. They sit and read Psalms for the soldiers in Israel. There is just so much that is going on. And every week we have different people coming in and talking about the situation in Israel. And these are all new speakers that we didn't have on our schedule before Rosh Hashanah. So it's just become something remarkable in terms of how the grassroots have responded. So, yes, my life is different. I haven't even had a chance really to reflect on the question because it's like you're running. I don't have the time to think about not running because that's all I'm doing. But the one thing that really touches me, and it's the same thing that I saw in Israel, and I see it here in our community, is that, absolutely everybody is fully engaged.
What about you, Elliot?
Look, I have also had many sleepless nights. I think the Ambien people are doing very well these days. I think that this is, I'll say a few things. One of the great challenges, I think, of being a rabbi is that you have to hold the pain of a community while you yourself are experiencing it. And you need to shepherd a community. It could be the loss of a member of the community. It could be any sort of moment that you yourself are feeling something, and at the same time you're thrust into a leadership position and expected to lead and guide. And that's not easy on the loss of one human being, and it's very challenging now. I mean, I don't know what your respective family situations are, but I have family who are serving in the IDF. I have, I was awoken to this news not because of a news report, but because a family member called, and said, this is going on right now, and you need to know this, a family member. So these are, I'm coping as best as I can, and at the same time trying to lead and direct that. Now, I can't say I'm happy to say, but I can affirm your experience, Chaim, and I imagine your experience, Angela, that it is the community has totally risen to the occasion, and so if I think leadership's really important. I think whether it's showing up to a rally, giving to relief, whatever way people mobilize, performing acts of chesed, people want to be engaged, people want to do, and for me, directing my manic energy towards helping others direct their manic energy, and I think to myself of a young soldier who is sleeping in a tank or somewhere in Gaza. And I say to myself, you know what, Cosgrove, you didn't sleep that well last night. You slept a lot better than that kid. And just go to work and show up the next day. And so that's, I can't say been comfort, but much as this is a challenging moment, and I stand by my words that I wouldn't want this moment if I could script it differently. No one would. I feel that it's incredibly purposeful work right now. Oh, and one last thing. And this goes back to what you were saying about the wedding that took place in Israel. People are still being born. There's still brisses. There's still weddings. There's still,
funerals too.
There's funerals too, right? And so, and I have found, because in those first few weeks there was a lot of hand-holding, and there still is. Every bar mitzvah family, is it okay that we're celebrating? How do I rewrite this Devar Torah of a 12-year-old because they want to talk about Taylor Swift, and now they want to, want to talk about Israel, and they don't want to be tone deaf to the moment. And I continue to come back to this idea that as Jews we choose life. And we know how precarious it is. We know how delicate that it can come and go, and so we choose life. And those moments, this last month, where I've been standing with a couple under the chuppah, or with a family yesterday at the bris of a newborn child, those have filled my cup. Not only have I felt that it's okay, I've actually felt that it's really, really important that we are there, celebrating love, celebrating life. It's important for them, and it's important for us.
I had a baby naming,
100%.
and the baby was named Golda Chaya. So we went, but the Golda was a family name, but I said to everyone, this is such a precious moment for us to be able to celebrate and say, Am Yisrael Chai. And I said, particularly because it reminds us that 50 years ago, we had a prime minister by the name of Golda who showed with an enormous amount of courage what it means to stand up to the onslaught. And every baby, every wedding, I had a wedding where the couple came to me, and now I'm suggesting it to every couple. They said, we want to sing Hatikva before we break the glass. And we got everybody up at the wedding, and we all sang Hatikva together.
Beautiful.
Beautiful. What about you, Angela?
I think, I've not lived through really a war that feels like one that we've been engaged in as a country, but for the Jewish people, I feel like we've been mobilized for a war, and to do what we can do from here. And I do think that has been, raising funds, and after meeting hostage families, like organizing for everyone to make a phone call every day to their elected officials to bring them home. And it really, I realized that so much of what despair looks like is a sense of helplessness in the face of this, and actually hope is not that we can make it all better, but hope is still having agency to make something a little bit better, to do our part. And I think that we have successfully, as a Jewish community, found ways to really do our part and to be connected, and it feels purposeful and meaningful and deeply important for us to be able to do that. And by the way, when I went to Israel, they said how much it matters. Like, the funds matter, our presence matters, our showing up matters. And so all of that feels really good. I think that we've also understood that we are, as rabbis now, we are on a battlefield or a battleground. I don't want to sound overly dramatic, here in America as well. The harder thing is that we don't really have like a strategy right now on that. And so in many ways, I think all of us feel like a little bit like we're playing whack-a-mole. I get this call from this school and they want us to address a particular issue, or on this college campus, or this is happening in their workplace and they're not putting out a statement, or this thing has erupted. And so we're all kind of playing defensive right now on something that is so much bigger than little mini battles that are one-offs. And so I think that, frankly, we've been taken by surprise by what has been revealed and perhaps unleashed in the last month. And it's been sort of painful to see those who, maybe they're not our enemies, but those who've remained silent in the face of the worst atrocity that's befallen our people since the Holocaust, or watching as others sort of talk about Israel in a way that feels actually dishonest. And so I think that we haven't had a chance to catch our breath and figure out, like, how are we addressing this? And I'm very committed. My general style is to actually give people benefit of the doubt and to help educate and to bring people in and have conversations. And I just trust that actually most people are good and want to do this. But the tenor right now is to explode things and to cancel people and to make statements. And I think that is a dangerous place to be. And I recognize why we're doing it, because we feel raw and emotional. And frankly, I feel that myself. And but we need to bring ourselves back to a place where we can actually think about what our end game is and what's the best path for us to move forward as a Jewish community. And I'm not sure we've had a chance to draw up those plans.
Right. I mean, I think the key thing, and it's just a short note, the key thing is that we need to be motivated by love for ourselves rather than the hatred of others.
Absolutely. That's great.
And the reason why we're doing what we're doing is because we want to protect ourselves, we want to protect our homeland, we want to build a future with peace and security. This is not about hatred. And a lot of people do get sidetracked. Oh, this person, even if they're supportive, but they're not supportive enough. Mm-hmm. And they spend their time getting sidetracked on, but why didn't they do X? AIPAC had put out a call to send letters to a particular elected official because they had been supportive. And so we circulated that call. And one of my members writes to me, but this political official didn't do X, Y, and Z. Mm. And I wrote back and I said, now's not the time to think about that. Mm-hmm. Now I'm just thinking about what's good for Israel. And this is good for Israel. And we have to stop getting sidetracked. And we certainly, although this is a time when you're vulnerable to emotions like hatred, you're vulnerable to negative emotions where you do spend your time trying to just get at people. We need to keep our eye on the bigger picture. Sometimes you do need to push people out of the way, and you certainly do need to make sure that people who have their hands on the levers of power are people who understand the situation properly and support Israel. But at the same time, our motivation is simply to support Israel. Our motivation is love, and our motivation is life. That's the motivation.
Yeah.
I think what's hard is that I feel like my job is to raise or to help create a community of, joyful, engaged, literate, loving Jews. And I really have resisted feeling that part of my job as a rabbi is fighting anti-Semitism. It's really not. It's not really where I want to spend my time. But I don't think that we can exempt ourselves from this any longer, even as I think that I still need to pour more of my energy into making sure that I don't think that no matter what we do, we're going to be able to end the world's oldest hatred. It's just not going to happen in our lifetime. Hopefully it will calm down from the place that it is right now. But in the end of the day, we need Jews who, even if people say things that are not kind or worse, that they feel confident and comfortable in themselves as Jews. That still has to be our first job.
Right. There is this question on the table as to whether or not, what's happening in American Jewry right now, and what's happening with anti-Semitism right now, and the line between AntiZionism and anti-Semitism has been blurred, if not totally elided right now. Mm-hmm. And I don't traditionally see myself as I'm not the Jonathan Greenblatt of the Jewish world. I'm glad Jonathan Greenblatt is the Jonathan Greenblatt of the Jewish world, but our families are experiencing something. In my community, there are some day school families, but the vast majority of families are families in public and private secular schools. And so I'm actively seeing it play out. On the one hand, Jews, I think, are coming together in sort of this global Shiva house thing, right? We want to be with each other because we've been traumatized. We want to be comforted, and we want to be with people who are empathetic and who are sympathetic, right? No different than any Shiva house. On the other hand, there's this sort of tribalism that's emerged because I think people feel that Israel has been attacked on October 7th, Jews have been attacked on October 7th, and humanity has been attacked, but it's a very disorienting time for American Jewry. And I think, then, look, we have the privilege of tapping in and tapping out of it, what's going on in Israel, but not as much here, because these are, there's thuggery that's going on the streets. There's obviously real vicious acts of anti-Semitism, like those experienced on October 7th. And then there's this sort of need to situate the events of October 7th in sort of this world of moral equivalency that sort of refuses to just call out evil for evil. Right? I mean, I know my politics happen to be pretty progressive when it comes to two-state solution, Palestinian self-determination. Like, I know where I stand politically, but then I find myself somewhat bereft when I see the progressive community failing to call out evil as evil, certainly evil against my people. And so it's a very disorienting time right now. As an American Jew.
I mean, I would just say that there's like going back to the college students, I mean, there's a real sense of betrayal, and there's a sense of betrayal for all of us. I mean, the students watched their friends on October 8th go out and essentially express solidarity with the people that murdered their brothers and sisters in Israel. And that's a profound betrayal. And then, of course, for your professors sometimes to be leading the charge, and the administrators of your school basically saying, well, we're going to try to stay out of it. I mean, everything else we get involved in except for the murder of Jews in Israel. And there was a profound sense of betrayal, not just for the students, but for the American Jewish community. And I think a lot of it has to do with this. For most American Jews, these very universities were the way that they found their way home in the United States. Mm-hmm. These were the vehicles of success for Jews. You get into a good university, you get a good job, you get settled, you become part of the American mainstream. And so the American Jewish dream has been betrayed. And I think that's that fills us with such angst. Because the myth that we had was that we're going to make it, and this is how we make it. And now we realize we haven't made it at all. It's really very painful.
Right. Well, yeah, are the universities, have they failed? I actually quite like, in all its discomfort, your thesis, right? But is it the death of the promise of emancipation and enlightenment, or is this our Hurtz Soul moment that we realize that we are not accepted the way we thought we would be, as Hurtz Soul experienced with the Dreyfus affair, or is it that there's something rotten in our university systems themselves, and that needs to be addressed both short term and long term? I don't know the answer to it, but I've thought a lot about the question.
Right, it could be both at the very same time. In other words, that they both sort of can sit side by side. If the university system is producing people like this, and you spoke about how AntiZionism and AntiSemitism have a relationship. The primary relationship now is that AntiZionism is basically taking all of the myths of anti-Semitism and using it, just changing one word. They changed Jew for Israel. If they remember, it's like auto. It's like when you do find and change on a document. Sometimes you miss. Sometimes you miss the find and replace. So sometimes Jew does come through, but basically they've taken anti-Semitic myths and just recycled them and talk about Zionism in the very same way. So is it that the universities have fallen apart? I heard a very interesting thesis recently that the universities focusing more on paying jobs and training people for paying jobs meant that the humanities were abandoned. And because the humanities were abandoned, then all sorts of political activists were able to take over the humanities. I mean, who knows? I mean, it's probably a little bit of both.
All sorts of theories.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in many ways, there's a real darkness that I think that you're expressing that we're all feeling, and not really knowing exactly how to get through this. But I can't help but think that we're just a few weeks away from Hanukkah, which, not coincidentally comes at the darkest time of our year and offers a miracle of light. And I think it reminds us always that this is not the first time our people have been in a very dark place and somehow prevailed, have somehow come through it. And I guess, could we end on a note of maybe one lesson of Hanukkah that can take us into these weeks ahead, give us some way of framing this experience, this darkness that we're in with a historical, little rhetorical lift.
Right. Well, it is a question.
Rabbis.
When three
that
rabbis,
is our job, isn't it?
Right. But we're all going to give a Hanukkah sermon in the next few weeks. So the question
give me a preview.
is, well, I'll start. I think, but I'm going to split the difference, because I think the well-worn Hanukkah sermon is it a story about miracles, about the oil that lasted a little bit longer than anyone thought it was going to, or is it what we read in the prayer book with Al Hanisim, a military victory of the few against the many, and the forces of good over darkness? And depending on the year, sometimes we choose this one, and sometimes we choose that one, and otherwise. I think this year it's both. There's a military story right now. It's inescapable. It is, the modern day Maccabees in the form of the IDF fighting for the defense of the Jewish people. And you know what? I'm also praying for a miracle. I want those hostages out. I want those hostages alive. I think there has to be a little bit of the caress of the divine in this moment, because it is all tangled up. I have to say, in this time of the darkness of the calendar year, it's very hard to see the light. Mm-hmm. So I'll take a miracle.
I'm thinking about our commandment of Pirsumei Nisa, of publicizing the miracle. And I think of a story that is actually much, much more recent, but it just feels very resonant. It's the story of like a little boy who lived in Billings, Montana, which was actually became a hub of sort of white supremacist hate. And his family, it took some courage, but had put their menorah in their window, as we are all commanded to do, to publicize the miracle, and found that a brick with a hateful message had been thrown through the bedroom door of this little boy. Thankfully, he was not in his bed and he was not hurt, but it really was upsetting. And here's where I think the more miraculous part was. They went to their rabbi and worried, maybe we need to take the menorah down. This is not safe for us. And instead, the rabbi called together faith leaders from the town, told them this story, and all of them at church on Sunday said, this is what happened, this is not who we are, this is not the town we're going to be in, and encouraged people to put menorahs in their windows. Non-Jews. There are very few Jews in this town. The Billings paper printed a paper menorah on a full page of their newspaper and invited people to put them in their windows. And literally tens of thousands of people in this town put the menorah in their window. And as a sign of solidarity, it became this beautiful story, and it actually created a movement, not in our town. And they really drove out the hate. And I think that is such a message for us today. First of all, that we can't hide being Jews. It feels like a fearful time sometimes to be out. I'm wearing a blue ribbon, and someone saw me with this and said, I'm afraid to wear my blue ribbon out in the subway. And I understand that. I think that we feel vulnerable when we are outwardly expressing our Jewishness or our solidarity or wearing a Jewish star. And I guess I would say, I don't judge that fear. I completely understand it, but we also have to stand up as Jews and do it proudly. And then we also have to find our allies, because we are a tiny people here in America, in the world even tinier. And we need our allies and our friends who will stand up with us and put their proverbial menorah in the window and stand with us. And so I take that as a call to action and a hopeful story for us.
So I mean, Elliot mentioned the war and the menorah, and they kind of both have very significant messages. I mean, it's interesting. The Maccabees for the early Zionists played a very large role, because actually the Maccabees, before the state of Israel, the Maccabees were the last time that Jews had actually won a war. It was almost 2,000 years. It was the last time they had won a war, and it was a powerful example. We can do this. We can stand up for ourselves, because through exile, Jews didn't stand up for themselves for the most part. They didn't have an army, they didn't have the power, they didn't have the capability. And to go back to Rav Tamir Gronot, who I told you his son Amitai fell in battle right at the beginning of the war, he happens to have a PhD on Holocaust theology. And when he spoke about his son, he said, one thing I have to think about is at least this time we can defend ourselves. We can stand up for ourselves. So looking back at that war of the Maccabees, which was a war again to defend, here too, we can defend. We can fight back. We're not powerless. And there's something very precious and very holy in being able to protect your own children, your own family. And then on the flip side, you've got the menorah. And the menorah always reminds me of the Baal Shem Tov's famous saying that a little bit of light can dispel a lot of darkness. And if there are miracles that we're hoping for, we see a ton of darkness around us. We were talking earlier about how we feel this darkness in the room. Let's hope we can light a candle that can push away a lot of that darkness.
Amen. Well, it's been a privilege to sit with you both, as always, and I always learn from you and appreciate being able to be a part of your lives as well, all of you who are watching from your living rooms or wherever you are on Jewish Broadcasting Service. And it's a gift for us to stand together with all of you in this challenging time for our people and for Israel, but to know that we're doing this together. So we wish you a season of light and some miracles, we hope, and we hope you'll join us again on JBS. Thank you.